Dermatologist has been continued. Dr. Emily Yu is accused of trying to poison her husband with liquid drain cleaner. Prosecutors say images from a hidden camera placed in the kitchen of the Irvine couple shows Dr. Yu allegedly pouring the drain cleaner in beverages for Jack Chen.
Case 1. Emily Yu, August 4th, 2022, Orange County Superior Court, California. Irvine, California is the kind of city that shows up on best places to live lists year after year. Wide streets, good schools, low crime rates, and manicured neighborhoods where residents pride themselves on stability. It's the last place most people would expect a criminal investigation involving poison. But behind the closed doors of one Irvine household, something was quietly, methodically going wrong. Dr. Jack Chen was a physician, a man trained to notice things others might miss, to catch the small signal before it became a large problem. That instinct, colleagues would later suggest, may have been what saved his life. In the spring and summer of 2022, Chen began to notice something off about his tea and his lemonade. Not spoiled, not stale, something chemical, a bitterness that didn't belong. Most people, tasting something strange in a drink, might assume it was a cleaning residue on a glass or a memory of the cup's last use. But Chen kept noticing it. Again and again. The frequency was what troubled him most. This wasn't a one-time fluke. It was a pattern. And patterns, to a trained clinical mind, are rarely coincidence. At the time, Chen and his wife, dermatologist Emily Yu, were navigating a marriage under significant strain. The two were, according to later court filings, in the process of a divorce, and a custody dispute involving their children loomed over the household. It's against this backdrop, a marriage falling apart, two professionals with high-stakes careers, and now, a mysterious taste in the family's kitchen, that Chen made a decision that would ultimately change the direction of both of their lives. He didn't confront his wife. He didn't call the police first. Instead, quietly, methodically, Chen installed hidden cameras in the kitchen of their Irvine home. It was a decision born of suspicion he could not yet prove, and one that would soon provide, prosecutors allege, undeniable visual evidence. According to the criminal indictment, the footage told a disturbing story. On more than one occasion in the summer of 2022, the cameras allegedly captured Yu removing a bottle of liquid drain cleaner from beneath the kitchen sink, carefully lifting the plastic wrap covering her husband's drink, pouring in a portion of the chemical, and then meticulously replacing the covering exactly as it had been, as if nothing had happened at all. Liquid drain cleaner is not a subtle substance. It's designed to dissolve organic matter in plumbing systems, hair, grease, buildup, using highly caustic chemical compounds. Ingested even in small amounts, it can cause severe internal injury. Chen, according to his own account, began suffering from worsening gastrointestinal symptoms. He was later diagnosed with stomach ulcers, gastritis, and esophagitis, injuries that shocked investigators when the full timeline of his symptoms was laid out against the footage. Once Chen had what he believed was definitive proof, he turned the beverage samples over to the Irvine Police Department. Those samples were eventually sent to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for forensic testing. According to the Orange County District Attorney's Office, that testing confirmed the presence of a substance consistent with liquid drain cleaner in the beverages Chen had submitted. Investigators also noted something unusual and deeply symbolic at the scene: rose petals, both yellow and red, scattered across Gregory's body. To anyone familiar with contemporary American cinema, the image was almost immediately recognizable. It closely mirrored a famous scene from the film American Beauty, in which a character fantasizes about being surrounded by rose petals. The defense argued that Gregory himself had arranged the petals as a final, symbolic gesture before taking his own life, driven by depression and despair over the state of his marriage. Prosecutors flatly rejected that theory, arguing that a man who had ingested such an overwhelming dose of fentanyl would have lost motor function and consciousness far too quickly to carry out such a deliberate, aesthetic act. As the investigation deepened, more troubling details emerged. 1 month after Gregory's death, both Rossum and Robertson were terminated from the medical examiner's office. Rossum for concealing her drug relapse, and Robertson for enabling her addiction and for engaging in a relationship with a subordinate employee, a clear violation of office policy. Investigators later discovered that fentanyl was missing from the office's controlled substance inventory around the time of Gregory's death, a detail that, combined with Rossum's professional access to the drug and her documented ability to handle and administer controlled substances safely, formed the backbone of the prosecution's theory of the case. That detail would prove to be the case's turning point. The road to trial was anything but smooth. In January of 2026, prosecutors moved to dismiss the original charges themselves, citing the need for further investigation after a key witness became unavailable to testify. Rather than closing the book on the case, the district attorney's office refiled, and this time, added new charges of attempted poisoning, a legal maneuver that, under California law, did not require prosecutors to prove that Chun had actually suffered injury from the alleged poisoning attempts, only that an attempt had occurred. The case went before a second grand jury. It was this second indictment that ultimately collapsed. In May of 2026, Orange County Superior Court Judge Patrick Donahue dismissed the case entirely. His ruling was pointed and specific. Prosecutors, he found, had failed to present the grand jury with evidence that could have been favorable to Yu's defense. Most critically, the FBI chemist's assessment regarding the beverage sample's pH levels. Under California law, prosecutors have an obligation to present exculpatory evidence to a grand jury, even when seeking an indictment. Judge Donahue found that obligation had not been met, and that had the grand jury been properly informed, there was a reasonable probability they would not have found probable cause to indict Yu at all. It is worth pausing here, because this is where fairness and accuracy demand precision. The dismissal of Yu's indictment was not a finding of innocence. It was a procedural ruling about how the prosecution's case had been built and presented, not a verdict on what actually happened between her and her husband in the summer of 2022. Yu has maintained her innocence throughout the proceedings. Her attorneys have publicly stated that the entire allegation stemmed from a bitter, high-stakes divorce, arguing that Chun fabricated or exaggerated the poisoning narrative to gain leverage in the couple's ongoing child custody battle, a claim prosecutors and Chun's own divorce attorney have firmly disputed. The Orange County District Attorney's Office, for its part, did not accept the dismissal as the end of the matter. A spokesperson for the office publicly stated their intention to refile the case, expressing continued confidence in the strength of the evidence and the conduct of the prosecutors who built it. In the meantime, the human cost of the case has been significant on both sides. Yu's attorneys have described the toll of the prolonged legal battle. Her medical career effectively paused for years, her contact with her own children limited largely to video calls amid the ongoing custody dispute. Chun, for his part, has continued to cooperate with prosecutors and has stated through his divorce attorney that his focus remains on protecting himself and his children through both the criminal case and the family court proceedings that continue to run alongside it. Because this case remains legally unresolved, and because a court has explicitly stated that this dismissal is not a finding of innocence, we present it here as it stands, a serious accusation, backed by video evidence and forensic testing, but one that has not yet been tested by a jury or resulted in a conviction. It would be irresponsible and simply inaccurate for us to describe Yu as a murderer or a poisoner, or to treat the prosecution's theory as established fact. What we can say is that this is a case actively being watched by prosecutors, defense attorneys, and the community alike, with real legal consequences still to come. What makes this story so unsettling isn't a verdict. It's the uncertainty itself. A marriage collapsed. A family fractured. Careers were paused indefinitely. Children were caught in the middle of a legal fight that, years later, still has no final resolution. Whatever the truth eventually turns out to be, this case is a sobering reminder of how deeply the legal process, its procedures, its burdens of proof, its checks and balances, can shape and reshape a family's future long before any final answer is reached. If you or someone you know is in a relationship where you feel unsafe, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available at 1-800-799-7233, offering confidential support at any hour of the day or night. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 2, Kristen Rossum, November 6, 2000, San Diego County Superior Court, California. On paper, Kristen Rossum was exactly the kind of person society tells us to trust. Bright, educated, employed in a field dedicated to uncovering the truth about how people die. She graduated with honors from San Diego State University with a degree in chemistry, and by the year 2000, she had secured a position as a toxicologist at the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office, an institution responsible for determining cause of death in every suspicious fatality across the county. It was, in almost every sense, a career built on scientific integrity. But beneath the professional polish, Rossum was fighting battles that had followed her since adolescence. She had struggled with methamphetamine addiction for years, a struggle she had largely kept hidden from her employer and, for a time, from the man who would become her husband. That man was Gregory DeVillers, a pharmaceutical chemist from a prominent family, who Rossum had met years earlier near the San Diego-Tijuana border. By most accounts, DeVillers was instrumental in helping Rossum work through her addiction in the mid-1990s, and the two eventually married in 1999, appearing to friends and family as a couple who had found stability together after difficult beginnings. That stability did not last. In the months leading up to November of 2000, Rossum's life began to unravel on two fronts simultaneously. She had relapsed into methamphetamine use, a fact she went to considerable lengths to conceal. And she had begun an affair with her direct supervisor at the medical examiner's office, Dr. Michael Robertson, the chief toxicologist overseeing her work. It was an arrangement built on secrecy, professional risk, and personal betrayal, and Gregory DeVillers eventually discovered both truths at once. According to court testimony, DeVillers confronted his wife, making clear that if she did not end the affair and address her drug use, he intended to report both to her employer, a disclosure that would very likely have ended her career at the medical examiner's office, and possibly her marriage as well. For Rossum, prosecutors would later argue, the threat represented an existential crisis, the collapse of her professional reputation, her relationship, and the carefully constructed image she had built for herself. On the evening of November 6, 2000, just after 9:15, Kristen Rossum called 911. She reported that her husband was unresponsive and told responding officers and, later, detectives, that he had appeared deeply depressed in the days leading up to his death. Her own father would later testify that Gregory had seemed distressed and had been drinking heavily on the night he died, testimony the defense would lean on heavily as their case developed. Because the death occurred in the home of a medical examiner's office toxicologist, and because Rossum herself worked within the very institution responsible for investigating suspicious deaths, San Diego officials made a critical decision early in the process. Rather than allow the local office to handle the autopsy, they outsourced the examination to an independent laboratory in Los Angeles, in order to avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest. That decision would prove to be pivotal to the entire case. The independent lab's toxicology results were staggering. Gregory DeVillers had approximately 7 times the lethal dose of fentanyl in his system, an amount investigators considered wildly inconsistent with recreational or accidental use, and one that pointed toward deliberate administration. Investigators also noted something unusual and deeply symbolic at the scene: rose petals, both yellow and red, scattered across Gregory's body. To anyone familiar with contemporary American cinema, the image was almost immediately recognizable. It closely mirrored a famous scene from the film American Beauty, in which a character fantasizes about being surrounded by rose petals. The defense argued that Gregory himself had arranged the petals as a final, symbolic gesture before taking his own life, driven by depression and despair over the state of his marriage. Prosecutors flatly rejected that theory, arguing that a man who had ingested such an overwhelming dose of fentanyl would have lost motor function and consciousness far too quickly to carry out such a deliberate, aesthetic act. As the investigation deepened, more troubling details emerged. 1 month after Gregory's death, both Rossum and Robertson were terminated from the medical examiner's office. Rossum for concealing her drug relapse, and Robertson for enabling her addiction and for engaging in a relationship with a subordinate employee, a clear violation of office policy. Investigators later discovered that fentanyl was missing from the office's controlled substance inventory around the time of Gregory's death, a detail that, combined with Rossum's professional access to the drug and her documented ability to handle and administer controlled substances safely, formed the backbone of the prosecution's theory of the case. Perhaps the most damning piece of physical evidence, however, was mundane, a credit card receipt. The timestamp on that receipt placed Rossum away from the home at a specific moment, a moment during which she had told investigators she was at home, caring for her ailing husband. The discrepancy undercut her account in a way that few other pieces of evidence could. It suggested not confusion or grief-clouded memory, but a deliberate misstatement about her whereabouts during a critical window of time. The trial itself, held in San Diego County Superior Court, drew significant media attention, both for its lurid personal details, addiction, infidelity, a toxicologist accused of turning her professional expertise into a murder weapon, and for the broader questions it raised about trust in forensic institutions. Prosecutors built their case around a chilling narrative that Rossum had access to what they described as close to the perfect poison, a substance she understood intimately through her professional training, one she knew would be unlikely to trigger automatic suspicion in a home death, and one that, absent independent lab testing, might never have been detected as anything other than a tragic overdose. On November 12, 2002, the jury returned its verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. On December 12th of that year, Superior Court Judge John Thompson sentenced Kristen Rossum to life in prison without the possibility of parole, along with a $10,000 fine. In handing down the sentence, the judge rejected defense motions for a new trial, emphasizing that the sentence would ensure Rossum could never again be released into the community if it were upheld on appeal. Rossum's legal battle did not end with her conviction. In 2010, a panel of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals raised concerns that her trial attorneys should have independently tested for fentanyl metabolites, chemical byproducts the body produces when processing the drug, potentially strengthening or complicating the defense's argument. The panel ordered a federal district court in San Diego to hold a hearing on whether that failure had affected the outcome of the original trial. Ultimately, despite years of appeals working their way through both state and federal courts, Rossum's conviction and sentence have remained in place. She continues to serve her sentence at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, the largest women's correctional institution in the United States. The story did not end in the criminal courts. In 2006, Gregory DeVillers' family pursued a civil wrongful death lawsuit against Rossum, her former supervisor Robertson, and San Diego County itself, alleging negligence in the office's failure to prevent Rossum's access to fentanyl. A jury found Rossum 75% liable and the county 25% liable for Gregory's death, awarding a combined $6 million in compensatory damages and, remarkably, $100 million in punitive damages against Rossum personally, a figure jurors arrived at in part by estimating how much money Rossum might one day earn by selling the story of her crime to books, films, or media outlets. A judge later reduced the punitive award substantially, though the underlying message from the jury was unmistakable. Whatever profit Rossum might one day seek from her own infamy, the law intended to make sure she never saw a cent of it. Gregory DeVillers' family has said publicly that no amount of civil compensation could undo what was lost. A 26-year-old man with a promising career and a family who loved him, whose life was cut short not by illness or accident, but by someone he had trusted completely. Their pursuit of both criminal and civil justice reflects something this series returns to again and again, that accountability, even when it comes slowly, and even when it can never truly restore what was lost, still matters. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 3, Angelina Rodriguez, September 9, 2000, Los Angeles County Superior Court, California. Some true crime stories begin with a single, sudden act of violence. Others unfold slowly, methodically, across weeks and months, with each failed attempt only sharpening the resolve behind the next one. The case of Angelina Rodriguez belongs firmly to the second category, a case investigators would eventually describe not as a single crime, but as an escalating campaign. Jose Francisco Frank Rodriguez was, by every account from those who knew him, a gentle and dedicated man. He worked as a special education teacher, a profession that demanded patience, compassion, and a genuine investment in the well-being of some of the most vulnerable students in the school system. It was through his work, specifically at a camp in San Luis Obispo, California, that he met Angelina, a woman with a complicated personal history that Frank, by most accounts, knew little about at the time. The two married in April of 2000, in what was Angelina's fourth marriage. For Frank, still relatively early in his career and by nature trusting of the people in his life, it appeared to be the beginning of a new chapter. For Angelina, according to the case prosecutors would later build, it was something else entirely, an opportunity. Within months of the wedding, Angelina took out a life insurance policy on her new husband valued at $250,000, a substantial sum, particularly for a public school teacher's household, and one that, adjusted to more recent dollar values, would represent well over $400,000 today. Prosecutors would later argue that this policy was not a responsible act of financial planning between newlyweds, but the opening move in a calculated plan. What followed, according to the case built against her, was not one attempt on Frank's life, but a series of them, a pattern investigators would later lay out methodically for the jury. The first alleged attempt involved the family's home appliances. Prosecutors say Angelina loosened a gas valve connected to the clothes dryer, creating a hazardous situation that, had it gone differently, might have resulted in a fire, an explosion, or gradual gas poisoning. It did not succeed in harming Frank. The second attempt, prosecutors allege, involved oleander, a plant strikingly common in Southern California landscaping, prized for its resilience and its vivid flowers, and almost universally unknown to the average homeowner as one of the most toxic ornamental plants grown in North American gardens. Every part of the oleander plant contains cardiac glycosides capable of causing severe heart arrhythmias, vomiting, and in high enough doses, death. Prosecutors argued that Angelina brewed oleander leaves into her husband's tea, hoping the natural, garden-variety poison would either kill him outright or, at minimum, go undetected as anything other than a sudden and mysterious illness. Toxicology testing later confirmed the presence of oleander glycosides in Frank's system, though not, ultimately, at a concentration high enough to have been the direct cause of his death. It was the third and final method, prosecutors say, that proved fatal. On September 9, 2000, Frank Rodriguez did not survive after prosecutors allege his wife mixed lethal doses of antifreeze into his Gatorade. Ethylene glycol, the primary toxic component of antifreeze, has a notoriously insidious quality that has made it a recurring substance in poisoning cases across the country. It has a sweet taste that masks its danger, symptoms that initially mimic common illnesses like the flu, and, critically for someone hoping to avoid detection, it does not show up in a standard autopsy toxicology screen unless a medical examiner specifically knows to test for it. That last detail nearly allowed Angelina Rodriguez to get away with it entirely. When Frank died, his death was initially ruled undetermined by the coroner's office. There was no obvious external trauma, no clear pathology, nothing that pointed definitively toward foul play. Under normal circumstances, an undetermined ruling might have been the final word, a tragic, unexplained loss, quietly closed and largely forgotten. But Angelina's own greed became her undoing. Without a determined cause of death, she was unable to obtain the death certificate required to formally collect on Frank's life insurance policy. Rather than accept the ambiguity, she pushed, repeatedly and insistently, for further testing, apparently confident that any additional examination would simply confirm natural causes and clear the path to her payout. Instead, the renewed testing, this time specifically screening for ethylene glycol, revealed concentrations in Frank's system 5 to 6 times the known lethal threshold, a result entirely incompatible with either accidental exposure or survival. Angelina Rodriguez was arrested for murder in Paso Robles, California, in February of 2001. As investigators dug deeper into her background, they uncovered something that, while never resulting in separate charges, would prove enormously influential in how the case against her was ultimately presented to a jury. In 1993, years before she met Frank, Angelina's 13-month-old daughter, Alicia, had died under circumstances she described as an accident. The child, she claimed, had choked when a pacifier's nipple became dislodged. Investigators who re-examined the case years later came to suspect something far darker, that Angelina had deliberately removed the pacifier's nipple and used it to smother her own daughter. She was never criminally charged in Alicia's death, but at the time, she sued the pacifier's manufacturer and was awarded a settlement of $700,000, and she also collected on a $50,000 life insurance policy taken out on the child. Prosecutors were permitted to introduce this history at trial, not as a separate criminal count, but as evidence establishing a pattern, a long-standing willingness to profit financially from the deaths of people who depended on her. The trial began in the fall of 2003, more than 3 years after Frank Rodriguez's death. Prosecutors built a methodical case around the escalating pattern of attempts, the financial motive established by the life insurance policy, and the toxicology results confirming ethylene glycol poisoning. In October 2003, a Los Angeles County Superior Court jury convicted Angelina Rodriguez of first-degree murder, finding true the special circumstance allegations of murder for financial gain. At sentencing in January of 2004, Los Angeles County Superior Court Judge William R. Pounders did not hold back in describing the impact the case had left on him personally. He stated that Angelina had killed her husband in a manner he described as exceptionally cruel and callous, and that in his 20 years on the bench, he had encountered few defendants whose guilt had been established with such absolute certainty. Angelina Rodriguez was sentenced to death. She did not accept the verdict quietly. Throughout the appeals process, she continued to maintain her innocence, arguing, remarkably, that Frank had died by suicide, deliberately poisoning himself with antifreeze. The claim struck many who followed the case, including the sentencing judge, as almost unfathomable given the layered, methodical nature of the evidence against her. The California Supreme Court reviewed her case and unanimously upheld both her conviction and her death sentence in February of 2014, finding no basis to overturn the jury's findings. Rodriguez then petitioned the United States Supreme Court for review, but that petition was denied later that year, effectively exhausting her direct appeals. Her case did not end there, however. Rodriguez pursued post-conviction relief through California's state habeas corpus process, arguing that her original trial attorney had failed to adequately investigate and present mitigating evidence during the penalty phase of her trial. Evidence related to her background, her mental health, and testimony from family members that might have persuaded jurors to spare her life even while convicting her of the underlying murder. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, reviewing the claim years later, conceded that it had merit specifically regarding the penalty phase, while maintaining that the guilt phase conviction itself remained entirely valid and well supported by the evidence. On October 31, 2024, Los Angeles County Superior Court Judge James R. Dabney held a re-sentencing hearing. Given the passage of time, the acknowledged penalty phase deficiencies, and the county's decision not to re-seek the death penalty, Rodriguez was re-sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At her re-sentencing, she once again denied any involvement in her husband's death, a final, defiant echo of the same claims that had failed to persuade either the original jury or the California Supreme Court. Angelina Rodriguez remains incarcerated today at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Her case has since been the subject of multiple television documentaries and true crime programs, a testament to how thoroughly it captured public attention, not just for its methodical, multi-attempt nature, but for what it revealed about how ordinary household items, hiding in plain sight in nearly every American home, can become instruments of calculated harm when placed in the wrong hands. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 4, Cynthia Sommer, February 18, 2002, San Diego County Superior Court, California. Not every case in this series ends the way you might expect. Some of the most important stories in true crime aren't about proving guilt. They're about confronting the terrifying possibility that the system got it catastrophically wrong. This next case is exactly that kind of story, and it deserves to be told with as much care and precision as any conviction we cover. Todd Sommer was 23 years old, a United States Marine Corps sergeant stationed at Miramar Marine Corps Air Station in San Diego. Those who served alongside him described a young man in good health, with no significant prior medical conditions. The kind of person whose sudden collapse would understandably raise immediate alarm among family, friends, and fellow service members. On February 9, 2002, Todd began experiencing gastrointestinal symptoms, nothing that initially seemed life-threatening, but persistent enough that he sought medical attention at a clinic. He was diagnosed with gastroenteritis, a common and generally non-serious inflammation of the digestive tract. He returned to the clinic days later, still unwell, and received the same diagnosis. Despite continuing to feel ill, Todd returned to work and even took his family to Knott's Berry Farm, an amusement park, where he rode a roller coaster, hardly the picture of a man in medical crisis. Then, on the night of February 17th, everything changed rapidly. Todd complained of his heart fluttering, and an ambulance was called. The following day, February 18th, 2002, Todd Sommer did not survive. In the immediate aftermath, his death was attributed to natural causes, specifically cardiac arrhythmia, a diagnosis made by the board-certified forensic pathologist who performed the initial autopsy at the Naval Medical Center in San Diego. For a time, that appeared to be the final, tragic explanation. A young, seemingly healthy man whose heart had simply, inexplicably, failed him. That explanation did not hold. Preserved tissue samples from Todd's body were later tested by a military laboratory associated with the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, and the results reportedly showed unusually high levels of arsenic, a finding that, if accurate, would have transformed what appeared to be a natural death into a homicide investigation. Naval Criminal Investigative Service agents, believing they had uncovered evidence of poisoning, began building a case centered on Cynthia Sommer, Todd's wife, theorizing that she had poisoned her husband in order to collect more than $250,000 in insurance benefits along with ongoing survivor benefits. There was, however, an early and significant warning sign that something might be wrong with the case, one that would take years to fully surface. In October of 2003, NCIS investigators consulted with a board-certified forensic toxicologist and recognized expert in arsenic poisoning at the Medical College of Virginia. After reviewing the arsenic testing results, that expert told investigators bluntly that the findings didn't make any sense, that there was no reliable evidence Todd Sommer had died of arsenic poisoning, and that he believed the test results themselves were flawed. That warning, delivered years before Cynthia Sommer's trial, did not stop the case from moving forward. Prosecutors built their case around more than just the disputed lab results. They pointed to Cynthia's behavior in the weeks following Todd's death, behavior that, whatever its ultimate relevance to guilt or innocence, undeniably shaped how the case was perceived by investigators and later by jurors. In the weeks after her husband's death, Cynthia obtained breast implants, became involved with multiple new partners, hosted parties, and eventually moved to Florida with a new boyfriend. Prosecutors also alleged that she made repeated inquiries about the insurance money in the hours immediately following Todd's death, a detail they used to paint a portrait of a woman more interested in profit than in mourning. The trial judge, prior to proceedings, had actually ruled that prosecutors could not introduce evidence of Cynthia's post-death behavior, recognizing its potential to inflame a jury's emotions rather than inform their judgment of the facts. But during the trial itself, the defense, in an effort to portray Cynthia as a grieving widow, inadvertently opened the door to that very evidence, and prosecutors introduced it in response, painting a picture starkly at odds with the sympathetic image the defense had attempted to establish. On January 30, 2007, a San Diego County Superior Court jury convicted Cynthia Sommer of first-degree murder, finding true the special circumstances of murder by poison and murder for financial gain. findings that made her eligible for a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. It seemed, at that moment, like the case was closed. It was not. Sommer retained new legal counsel following her conviction, and that legal team pursued the arsenic testing questions with a persistence the original defense had not fully mounted. They argued, forcefully, that her original trial attorney had failed to adequately challenge the reliability of the arsenic lab results. Results that, as the Virginia toxicologist had warned years earlier, simply did not add up. Perhaps most critically, the new defense team discovered that additional, previously untested tissue samples from Todd's body, samples that had been sitting, unexamined, in laboratory storage for years, still existed, despite prosecutors having previously told the defense no such samples were available. It was only after a formal discovery demand that the samples were located. Prosecutors later stated they had simply forgotten they existed. On November 30th, 2007, before Cynthia had even been formally sentenced for her January conviction, the trial judge vacated her conviction entirely and granted her a new trial. The judge's ruling centered on the fairness of how the case had been presented to the jury, particularly regarding the improperly admitted evidence of her post-death behavior, which the court found had likely inflamed the jury and deprived Cynthia of a fair trial. With a retrial scheduled for May of 2008, the newly discovered tissue samples, taken from Todd's liver and kidneys, tissue types where arsenic, if truly present in the concentrations originally reported, should have been unmistakably detectable, were finally tested. This time, at an independent laboratory, the results were unambiguous. No arsenic was detected in the samples at all. The implications were staggering. If the original arsenic findings had been accurate, these newly tested samples should have shown clear evidence of the same poisoning. Instead, they showed nothing. Forensic experts examining the discrepancy concluded that the original testing had almost certainly been compromised by laboratory contamination. The toxicologist who had raised early doubts back in 2003 had been right all along. In April of 2008, San Diego County District Attorney Bonnie DeMoniz formally moved to dismiss all charges against Cynthia Sommer. Announcing the dismissal, DeMoniz stated simply that justice had been done. Sommer's attorney offered a pointed rebuttal, saying that justice had indeed been served, but not because of the prosecution's efforts, despite them. Cynthia Sommer was released from custody immediately, after spending more than 2 years incarcerated for a crime that, based on the best available forensic evidence, never actually occurred as charged. Following her release, Sommer spoke publicly about her experience, describing her fear that other innocent people remain wrongfully convicted, sitting in prisons across the country under circumstances similar to her own. She pursued a $20 million federal lawsuit against the government, alleging that investigators and prosecutors had relied on falsified or reckless evidence in building the original case against her. That lawsuit was ultimately dismissed years later, with a federal judge finding that the original testing laboratory had met its standard of care in conducting the analysis, even as the case's overall trajectory, conviction, vacated verdict, exoneration, remained undisturbed. The evidence today strongly supports one conclusion. Todd Sommer died of natural causes, a cardiac arrhythmia, exactly as the very first medical examiner determined before flawed and likely contaminated arsenic test results ever entered the picture and derailed the investigation for years. Cynthia Sommer's case stands today as one of the most sobering reminders in the entire true crime genre, that even trained laboratories can produce catastrophically wrong results, that juries acting entirely in good faith can be misled by evidence that later completely falls apart, and that the presumption of innocence, however inconvenient it may feel in an emotionally charged case, exists precisely because miscarriages of justice like this one are possible and have happened right here in California's own court system. If this case has affected you, or if you'd like to learn more about wrongful conviction advocacy and the effort to prevent cases like this from happening in the future, organizations like the Innocence Project work directly with individuals and families navigating exactly these kinds of situations. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. for cases, for households across California, for very different outcomes. We began in Irvine with a case that remains unresolved to this day, a dismissed indictment, a prosecution vowing to refile, and a woman who has never been convicted of anything, presumed innocent under the law even as serious questions continue to surround her marriage. We moved to San Diego, where a toxicologist trained to detect poison became convicted of using it. Her own expertise turned into the very evidence that helped put her behind bars for life. We traveled to Montebello, where patience, a husband's insistence on answers, and later, investigators' refusal to let an undetermined death go unexplained, finally caught up with a killer who tried 3 separate times before succeeding. And we ended with a story that flips the entire genre on its head. A San Diego Marine's widow, convicted, then exonerated. A reminder that the system meant to deliver justice is run by human beings, and human beings make mistakes. Mistakes that can cost someone years of their life. What connects these 4 cases isn't just California, and it isn't just marriage. It's how ordinary the settings were. A kitchen, a cup of tea, a bottle of Gatorade in the refrigerator, a coffee shared after a hard day. These aren't remote, exotic locations or elaborate criminal schemes. They're the most familiar spaces in American life, which is exactly what makes these stories so unsettling. Poison, more than almost any other method, requires something the rest of us take for granted every single day: trust. Trust that the person handing you a drink has your best interests at heart. Trust that a household chemical stays under the sink where it belongs. Trust that a forensic lab, when it tells a jury arsenic, is actually right. 3 of these 4 cases remind us that trust can be broken in the most devastating way possible. The 4th reminds us that the system built to protect us can, on rare occasions, fail just as badly, and that when it does, the consequences fall just as heavily on an innocent person as they do on a guilty one. That's why cases like Cynthia Summers matter just as much as cases like Kristen Rossum's or Angelina Rodriguez's. Justice isn't only about convicting the guilty. It's also about protecting the innocent, catching our own mistakes, and having the humility to admit when we got it wrong, even years later, even after a conviction has already been handed down. If there's one thing we hope you take away from this documentary, it's this: look closely at the people around you. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, and never assume the full story is the one being told to you in the moment. Sometimes the truth takes years, forensic retesting, or a persistent family member to finally surface. And sometimes, as with Yu's case, the full truth hasn't been written yet at all. If you're dealing with concerns about your own safety in a relationship, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available anytime at 1-800-799-7233. And if you're interested in supporting the fight against wrongful convictions like Cynthia Summers, organizations like the Innocence Project continue that work every day. Thank you for spending this time with us here at Cold Case Hour. If this documentary kept you engaged, the best way to support the channel is simple. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like on this video, and let us know in the comments which of these 4 cases affected you the most. We read every comment, and your feedback helps shape which cases we cover next. We'll see you in the next one.